worked with several people in my life and known several people who had serious struggles when they were little and a lot of trauma, maybe even abuse, and they really didn't have serious emotional or behavioral struggles. However, I've also worked with several people who have had multiple losses, or once again, that could be moving home several times, moving schools several times, losing a best friend, or being bullied. I've worked with students who had no history of abuse, had a wonderful home environment, but yet they had situations like that started very small and budded into a full-blown thorn bush or oak tree. So we have to keep that in mind, and once again, we can't judge. We have to remember that trauma is subjective, but it's important to begin recognizing when emotional or behavioral issues are budding, so we're not waiting until that child once again walks into a school or a classroom with a gun. We want to begin to catch these issues early. Let's talk about what some of these budding emotional behavioral issues look like. We also want to remember that some of these that I'm going to cover, some of these could happen, and it doesn't mean that there's an issue budding. We want to watch for themes. We want to watch for themes and consistent behaviors or intense emotional roller coasters, not just a one-time instance. For example, if you have a child who has grades who are struggling and all of a sudden their grades drop, you want to watch for patterns where this child's grades consistently drop and he's not able to bring them back up. Not necessarily a child who goes from straight A's to having a B or a C in trigonometry, because that class is hard for those of us who are not math brains. We want to look for students who get in trouble often, and once again, not just those students who have those, strong little minds and strong little willed personalities, but we want to watch for those who get in trouble often, who stay in the principal's office or get written up. We want to watch for those who have victim-martyr behaviors. This is also a weed that can lead to violence, but also can lead to suicidal tendencies as well. Hyperactivity, impulsivity, flight mode, those students who are with you, but they're not really with you. That's something to keep in mind. I've worked with a lot of teenagers who, when you walk past them in the hallways, their eyes are cold and dark and they're really not with you. You may know what I'm talking about. That's definitely a sign, especially if they're at that age to where they're at that place that there's not a lot of affect or emotion. That's what we would call a symptom that we need to be watching for immediately and reach out for help immediately. But if you see children who are younger who have that kind of glazed look and they're not with you, that's a signal of disconnection. And later we'll talk about how we need to reach into that child's heart and start really sowing the innate needs and really putting emotion or putting oxygen on that child's heart, because we've got to begin to connect and help that child know that they are loved and cared for and valued and all of those wonderful things. We want to watch for students who lie, who manipulate often. Some of your most intelligent kids on the planet will do that. And it could be a learned behavior, but they've learned how to manipulate and twist situations to self-protect or maybe get out of a situation. Inattention is one. The child who socially withdraws and is a loner. Look for those students who are at recess and sit by themselves and never socialize. Watch for those students who pull away from the group. That's already starting to lean towards disconnection. Remember, disconnection is not healthy long term. We all probably enjoy moments of being alone and just having time to ourselves. That's healthy. But students who are never involved and are never connecting with other students, that's not healthy. We want to begin to think of ways to connect them. And we'll talk about that later with some of the strategies. We want to constantly look for ways to get the 7 and 8 needs inside that child's heart through not only verbal affirmations, but physical actions. That child that's a loner, you may make it a point to sit with them at recess or connect and go talk to them, or have lunch with that child at recess occasionally. Those are ways that we can begin to sow the innate needs into their heart and help pull them out, which is really pulling some of the sad seeds out. Watch for students, of course, who are aggressive and who bully. That's a big indicator. We have an entire generation who really In a lot of ways, several of them are addicted to video games and to violence. And if you're putting that in your mind constantly and you already struggle with neglect and disconnection, that's a recipe for disaster. We have to really, really pay attention to that. Once again, if our students are really addicted to some of those violent video games. We also know that there's a correlation with the bully with violent tendencies, but there's also a correlation with the bully and suicidal tendencies. A lot of people don't know that, but that goes back to, once again, a lack of connection. So we want to pay attention to both the bully and the bullied. There are, when you begin to look at some of the school shootings, some of those who committed those horrific acts, they were bullied, and they said that they were bullied. And so not necessarily were they the aggressor. So you want to pay attention to that. Explosive anger is a big one. What is causing that child to explode? That's definitely a reason to start putting the innate needs as much as we can into that child's heart. And of course, if you're able to get these students into counseling, therapy services, that's excellent, because the more that we can help get involved when these students are young, when these children are young, the better, right? So once again, if you're lacking in oxygen, you need oxygen. If you're lacking in electrolytes, you need electrolytes. If you're lacking in one or more of the 7 and 8 needs, we need to begin to sow those into the child's heart as much as we possibly can. Rage, that's definitely a big signal. We have to keep in mind that rage and anger doesn't just go away. It really operates like an addiction. You know, some people who may use, drink socially, well, we find if they begin to drink when they're in a really high emotional state, what does the brain do? It recognizes that and it begins to want more, and then it needs more to be able to take that pain away. Drugs and alcohol work the same way, or drugs work the same way. We know video games can become a full-blown addiction, and that's the only thing that calms that person. My brother's a therapist, and he's had several teenagers and young children where he works with them on being addicted to video games. One of the things that we have seen is that parents commonly will pull the video games completely away from that child and just cold turkey that child, which I understand that makes sense. But one of the things he's had to do is help parents understand they have to be weaned off. We have students who come to us who are suicidal, or they're having explosive anger outbursts. They're completely addicted, just like an alcohol or drug addiction, to those video games. So you have to understand that when the brain creates a neural connection, it's like a mud rut. Just like with any addiction, with alcohol, drugs, porn, the brain creates this neural pathway that sometimes is hard, very hard to get out of. Well, video games are the same thing. We have an entire generation whose brains are different simply because of everything that they have access to in our world. I have a lot of people who will say to me, well, you know, Shawna, when I was a kid, or I wish the world would go back to when my grandma was a kid. And even though I understand that, we have to understand that students in this day and time, children in this day and time, are exposed to way more than we were ever exposed to. And their brains are different. They are not, this is not the same generation as even when I was a child. So we have to think differently. We have to understand that addictions look a little differently, but they're happening younger and younger with this generation. Keep in mind that porn on a child's phone is 2 clicks away. An ad can pop up 2 clicks away, and that child can be exposed to porn. I've worked with several students, younger than 10 years old, some actually younger than 7, who are fully addicted to porn. And these were students from great homes with parents who love them very much, but they didn't understand the internet concept, and they basically had free reign. So we have to remember that, once again, this generation's different. We have to be watching for these things, and we've got to pay attention because some of our students, they are fully addicted, and addicted brains struggle. They absolutely struggle. Some other weeds that are budding is non-compliance with disciplinary actions. If a child is defiant, doesn't want to listen, doesn't want to follow orders or follow rules, that's important to pay attention to. That doesn't just go away overnight. Once again, just like any other addiction, it can become greater and greater and greater till the point the child doesn't listen to anything and does what he wants to do. Once again, discipline and consistency is very, very important. Children need boundaries. They need discipline. Children who cry easily and have a tough time with self-regulation, we know that is a budding emotional and behavioral disorder. Kids who get lost in books, they read, they don't socialize. I've had teachers say that, hey, this child's such an excellent reader. I love that she's on the playground and reads by herself all the time. Well, I love that she's reading too, but if that's all she's doing all day long and she's not connecting with other humans, that can be a big problem, because once again, humans need belonging and acceptance. It's one of the vitals. It's a vital requirement for the emotional brain. And that goes back to those 7 and 8 needs. We want to watch for students who tend to get upset over trivial matters, those who tend to worry often, those who stay tired often. These are all symptoms of budding emotional and behavioral issues. Kids who wear heavy clothes in the heat, those who urinate or soil their pants. I mean, these are issues. Yes, sometimes these can be medical conditions, but we want to pay attention because it also could be trauma or budding emotional and behavioral disorders. Complaints of stomach pains or headaches often. This is really important, and I'm going to pause here and I'm going to talk about this for a second, because this is something that I think gets overlooked often, but it's very important to pay attention to. The ACEs, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, is an excellent study to look at, because it talks about how early trauma can have drastic effects on one's health when they're older. Here in a little bit, we're going to talk about why the stomach and stomach pains or headaches can actually be a direct result of stressors or cortisol and adrenaline drips in the brain that is not shutting off. Now let's talk about violence and imminent danger signs. This child is at that place that we have not only a budding weed, we have a full-blown thorn bush, and we've got to find help or recognize that this child could be not only a danger to others, but a danger to himself or herself. Violent fantasy content, that's very important. If they're obsessed with this, if they watch this, if they put this into their mind constantly, that is definitely a huge symptom that they could go to the place of fantasizing and loving it to actually doing it and being a part of it and committing it. Uncontrollable rage. Once again, that child who had rage issues when he was little, it didn't stay little. It grew with the child, and now we have uncontrollable rage. That's a big red flag. A preoccupation with death. Look for themes in drawings and writings. I had a teacher once, an art teacher, share that a young man had drawn like a noose around the neck on his sculpting project, and that's definitely a red flag. The child also had the dark stare and no affect. And so we have to understand that when a child is at that place of imagining it and it's playing out in their brain, it could just be moments, could be weeks, months, or never, but it could be moments before they get to the place that they're actually committing it. I always say that this out here is a projection screen of what's going on inside. And so it's important to pay attention to those imminent signs. Fascinations with weapons and fire. I think we've seen enough on the news to realize that when students are posting, if anyone recognizes that a student is posting anything that's alarming with weapons or guns, pay attention. Once again, not every student who posts about that is thinking about committing a violent act, but if you have students who have already had struggles or are struggling, especially those who have other symptoms and they're posting threats, that's a problem. Or if they're making threats to other students, even if it's subtle, pay attention. Those are imminent danger signs. Boasting, practicing fighting and combat proficiency. Once again, not every young man who likes to fight and scuffle and wrestle has violent, is going to go and commit a horrific act. However, many of these symptoms go hand in hand. You want to pay attention and go with your gut. Reach out to a counselor at your school, a mental health therapist, someone who can give you direction if you see any of these signs with a student or with your own child. Fascination with murders, serial killers. You want to pay attention to that. Are they researching this? Are they talking about it? If they're talking about it, why are they talking about it? Interest in previous shooting situations. What are they talking about? Once again, their drawings and writings will say a lot. Strange behavior, paranoia, behaviors that are just not typical of that child. That could tell us that the weed has taken a huge growth spurt, and that weed is getting closer to causing a problem, a major problem. Police and court system involvement. Look at their prior history. What's going on there? I've talked about the inappropriate affect, expressionless face, cold stares. That's definitely a symptom. I always go back to the concept of fight, flight, or freeze. That child is not with you. Where are they at? They're here somewhere in their brain. Flight, which sometimes we see ADHD behaviors, or they're imagining they're in a different world, but sometimes that different world flight mode could be violent fantasies and things that they're imagining over and over and over. Making or unusual interest in police, military, terrorist activities, materials, making statements about feeling hopeless, helpless, or worthless. This is where I go back to the concept, if a child is drowning in a pool of water and they're struggling to stay afloat, if they are a fighter by nature, if they are a flighter or a freezer by nature, how are they going to respond in trauma situations? So a child who is starting to feel hopeless and overwhelmed because they don't feel cared for, if they're at that place, one, that's a huge red flag for both suicidal behaviors and violent behaviors. Get that child help immediately, because some, when they feel uncared for, may make a final act. The depression or the anger is deepening, it's getting worse. Some other examples are taking unnecessary risk or exhibits self-destructive behavior. It's like they're not feeling anymore. I've had students before who came to see me who, one student told me years ago that he had numbed all of his feelings, and he was looking forward to being able to numb the bad feeling, the negative feelings that came with being bullied, because he said, if I can numb that feeling, I can numb everything and do whatever I want. That young man had actually made threats of bringing some serious harm to people. He had learned to numb his negative feelings when he was little. But once again, like other addictions, you can't just numb the good or the bad feelings. Eventually you'll begin to numb, and you'll need more and more and more and more and more to deal with the pain. And that's exactly what was happening. He had learned to numb all of his emotions. Those who are abusive to partners, siblings, parents, and relationships, those who have control, a lot of control. When a child feels helpless or a student feels helpless and out of control, internally, that's an easy projection. They begin to control others in relationships, which is very unhealthy. And of course, violence and cruelty to animals and others is a big red flag. We want to pay attention to if they have a history of violence or hurting animals. When is that moment going to go from hurting an animal to really bringing severe harm to another human being? So hopelessness is a driver to violence, just like it's a driver to suicide. When a child feels helpless, when they're not getting those needs, emotional needs met, that's when it's like they're in survival mode. They're swimming, trying to stay afloat in the water. But when that child gets to the point of extreme pain, of no one cares about me, no one loves me, no one even knows that I exist, and they start succumbing to the water and giving up, that's when we begin to see both suicidal tendencies and violent tendencies. It just depends on really how their personality, how they were made, and which direction they're going to go. Remember, it's the volcano. It either explode or implode. Another example is the splinter in the arm. When the splinter's in the arm and it begins to push to the surface, all that pain's going to keep pushing. Our mind works the same way. We can't keep pushing the splinter down and hoping it goes away. We have to begin to act and help these students now. And if you see these imminent warning signs, reach out, help, do everything you can to get help and seek help for that child, because the amount of time from the weed being small to full-blown could happen very quickly. And when I say to begin to instill the innate needs into that child's heart, it's like throwing a life raft to that child. It's like constantly throwing a life raft. Even though in your mind you may think and realize that you may be throwing the life raft to that child until they're 18 because of the horrible home life they came from, I still say we throw that life raft every chance we get until they get a chance to get out of that situation. That is actually the 7th innate need. It speaks to security. Security says that there's hope, and no matter how bad it is, I'm not going to quit because I'm going to give you hope, and I believe in you, and I'm coming to help you, and we're going to get you out of there. So hope for a child can literally be the thing that brings them out of the water and helps them realize that life is worth living and others' lives are worth living as well. So here are a few statistics. In 2015, homicide was the 2nd leading cause of death in the U.S. amongst teenagers, and it was replaced in 2016 by suicide. Nearly 50% of school shooters gave some type of warning signal, such as making a threat or leaving a note before the event. If we'll pay attention, when the splinter begins to come to the surface, the mind works the same way. Pain, symptoms, behaviors will begin to come to the surface. And if we tune our eyes and our ears in, we'll see it. From the standpoint of someone, from a teacher who has a student in your class who's struggling and they're out of control and their behaviors are just so hard to handle, I empathize for you. I was a teacher once. That can be so hard, especially when you have 19 or 20 other students in that same classroom. But one of the things I want you to realize and maybe see with a slightly different perspective is that from a therapy lens, that's when the splinter's poking out. And for us as clinicians, it's like, let's do it. Let's get that splinter out. We see it. When the splinter is poking to the surface and you actually see it, that's when you see all the symptoms. And that's really the time when the student or the adult or the child is like, I know I need help. Or they're ready because they're in trouble, behaviors are off the charts, life's not fun. And so that for us as clinicians, when I see the splinter poking to the surface, I'm like, let's go after it. I see it. So many times students aren't ready for help. They're not at that place. But when we hit rock bottom as humans, many times that person's like, okay, help me. But the most important thing I believe that I want you to grab a hold of in this training is let's not wait until the splinter's poking at the surface. Let's begin to impact these children with so many positive seeds in their heart that those negative seeds, even though they will grow, we know that negative seeds are going to grow, weeds are going to grow, we're human. A garden is not going to just produce flowers its whole life. Weeds are inevitable. But one of the things that we want to remember is that we can begin to sow so much love and acceptance and security into that child's heart so that it gets to soak up all the nutrients, just like a flower in a garden with weeds. Let's sow as many flowers as we can so the flowers are going to get the nutrients and the weeds do not get to take over. In our nation, 12 children die from gun violence in America. 32 are shot and injured. The U.S. has had 2,032 school shootings since 1970, and the numbers are increasing. 948 plus school shootings have taken place since the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in December 2012. Since the historic attack at Columbine High School in 1999, nearly 300,000 students have been on campus during a school shooting. So if you're in the school system and you see a student who is struggling and you're seeing these imminent warning danger signs, I would highly recommend as a district to have a plan in place. So what should you do if you have a student or a child or know someone who has the imminent warning danger signs of violence. The first thing I recommend for school districts is to have a plan in place. We don't want to wait until that student is at that place that they could do something horrific. Once again, we don't want to wait until the thorn bush is out of control. We want to catch it early. So I would suggest having a plan in place and making sure that there is a team of individuals who can help. And I would recommend that there are different individuals on that team from different areas, such as maybe a school counselor, a resource officer, a nurse, could be a teacher, admin. That way, if you have your school counselors are all gone for the day, you at least would have different people on the team who could help. I also recommend that teachers have a plan in place and know exactly what to do if they have a student who is exhibiting those warning signs. And in that plan, maybe line out who you would go to, where you would go, what would you say, how would that situation be handled. Since COVID-19, we are beginning to see more trauma coming to the surface. We're beginning to see more splinters come to the surface. And so it's very important that, once again, we have our plan in place, that we're ready to respond. And I would also say, trust your gut. And hopefully in the next section, when we talk about the actual strategies, I believe that will give you some hope and encouragement that there really are so many things that we can begin doing now as those weeds are growing. Even if we have students who have weeds that are full grown, we still need to get help for them immediately, but there's so many things that we can begin doing now to meet those innate needs that may be putting that child in helpless mode.